What happened to captured brides after a Viking raid was worse than death. In the shadow of burning monasteries and ransacked villages across medieval Europe, where the dragon-prowed longships had carved paths of destruction through peaceful settlements, there existed a fate more terrifying than the swift death of a warrior's blade. When Viking raiders withdrew from their bloody conquests, they carried with them not only gold and silver, but human prizes of a different kind, young women torn from their families and communities, destined for a life of captivity that would strip away everything they had once been. These captured brides faced ordeals so prolonged and devastating that many who witnessed their fate would whisper that death in the initial raid would have been a mercy compared to what awaited them in the longhouse of their captors. This is the investigation into the systematic abduction and exploitation of women during Viking raids, a practice that reveals the darkest aspects of Norse expansion and the brutal realities faced by countless victims whose names were erased from history. Through examination of contemporary chronicles from monasteries across Europe, archaeological evidence from Viking settlements, legal codes that codified these practices, and the scattered testimonies preserved in medieval records, we uncover the horrifying truth about what happened to women who survived the initial violence of Viking attacks only to face years of systematic abuse and cultural annihilation. Today, we explore the deliberate targeting of women during Viking raids, the traumatic processes of capture and transport, the systematic destruction of their previous identities, and the long-term psychological and physical abuse they endured as forced brides and concubines in Norse society. Drawing upon evidence from sites across Scandinavia, Britain, Ireland, and France, along with the detailed observations of contemporary chroniclers and the legal frameworks that governed these practices, we reconstruct a pattern of organized terror that was designed not merely to acquire wives, but to psychologically break entire communities through the systematic theft of their daughters and mothers. The strategic targeting of women during Viking raids was no accidental byproduct of warfare, but a calculated aspect of Norse military and economic strategy that served multiple purposes within Viking society. Contemporary accounts from the annals of Ulster and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle reveal that Viking raiders often showed remarkable restraint in killing women of childbearing age, instead focusing their lethal violence on men and older women, while systematically capturing younger females for transport back to Scandinavia. Archaeological evidence from raided settlements shows patterns of selective destruction that suggest raiders were operating under specific instructions about which members of communities to kill and which to preserve for capture. The initial trauma of capture began with witnessing the slaughter of family members and community defenders, an experience deliberately designed to break the psychological resistance of intended victims before the long journey to Scandinavian territories. Irish monastic chronicles describe how Viking raiders would force captured women to watch the execution of their male relatives, including fathers, brothers, and husbands, creating a state of traumatic shock that made escape attempts less likely during transport. The annals of the Four Masters record instances where Viking raiders would burn villages while forcing captured women to observe, ensuring that they understood their previous lives had been completely destroyed and return was impossible. The transportation of captured women, aboard Viking longships represented another layer of systematic abuse designed to further break their connection to their former identities. Archaeological analysis of Viking ships reveals modifications that suggest they were specifically adapted for human cargo, with evidence of restraint systems and confined spaces that could hold multiple captives during long sea voyages. Contemporary accounts from Frankish chronicles describe the overcrowded and unsanitary conditions aboard these vessels, where captured women were chained together in ship holds for journeys that could last weeks, with minimal food and no privacy or dignity. Upon arrival in Scandinavia, captured women faced a systematic process of cultural destruction that was designed to erase their previous identities and transform them into property within Norse society. Legal codes from Iceland and Norway reveal elaborate frameworks for the ownership and control of captured women, with specific laws governing how they could be distributed among raiders, traded between communities, or inherited by family members. The Gragas explicitly defines captured women as property that could be bought, sold, or gifted, while establishing legal procedures for their forced marriage to Viking men who had no obligation to consider their consent or preferences. The forced marriages that followed capture represented not romantic unions, but formalized systems of sexual slavery that were sanctioned by Norse legal and religious traditions. Saga literature, while often romanticizing these relationships in hindsight, contains scattered references that reveal the brutal realities faced by captured brides, including descriptions of women who were given no choice in their marriages and who lived under constant threat of violence if they showed resistance to their new circumstances. Archaeological evidence from Viking Age settlements includes grave goods that suggests some captured women achieved higher status over time. But the legal framework makes clear that this elevation remained entirely dependent on the whims of their captors. The psychological warfare aspect of these abductions extended beyond their immediate victims to terrorize entire communities and regions that lived under the constant threat of Viking raids. Contemporary chronicles from monasteries across Ireland describe how the systematic targeting of young women created climates of fear that disrupted normal social relationships, with families sometimes fleeing coastal areas entirely rather than risk losing their daughters to Viking raiders. The knowledge that capture meant not quick death, but prolonged suffering served as a powerful tool of intimidation that often caused communities to surrender without resistance when Viking ships appeared on the horizon. Evidence from burial sites associated with captured women reveals the long-term physical and psychological toll of their experiences, with skeletal remains showing patterns of stress, malnutrition, and violence that persisted throughout their lives in captivity. Isotope analysis of teeth and bones from these burials confirms that many women buried in Scandinavian sites during the Viking Age had originated from regions across Europe that were known targets of Viking raids, providing scientific confirmation of the scale and geographic scope of these abduction practices. The children born to captured women occupied a particularly complex and vulnerable position within Viking society, representing both evidence of their mother's ongoing exploitation and potential pathways to improved status within Norse communities. Legal codes reveal that while these children were technically free, Their mother's enslaved status meant they remained under the complete control of their fathers' families, with no legal connection to their mother's original cultures or communities. Archaeological evidence suggests that some of these children achieved significant status within Viking society, but always at the cost of completely abandoning any connection to their mother's heritage. Contemporary accounts from Christian missionaries working in Scandinavia reveal that captured women often became instruments of cultural and religious conversion, as their forced integration into Norse society required them to abandon their previous spiritual beliefs and adopt the religious practices of their captors. The gradual Christianization of Scandinavia during the later Viking Age created additional complications for these women, as church doctrine technically opposed forced marriage while providing few practical protections for women who were already trapped within these systems of exploitation. The international scope of Viking bride capture created networks of human trafficking that connected communities across medieval Europe through shared trauma and loss. Byzantine chronicles describe Viking merchants arriving in Constantinople with not only traditional trade goods, but also captured women who were sold in slave markets throughout the eastern Mediterranean, indicating that some abducted brides were transported far beyond Scandinavia to face additional layers of exploitation in foreign lands. The resistance strategies employed by captured women took many forms, from subtle acts of cultural preservation to desperate attempts at escape and even suicide. Runic inscriptions and saga accounts occasionally preserve references to captured women who maintained aspects of their original cultures despite systematic attempts to erase their identities, while archaeological evidence suggests that some women found ways to preserve cultural artifacts or practices that connected them to their lost homelands. The gradual decline of these practices during the later medieval period occurred not through moral enlightenment, but through changing military technologies and political structures that made large-scale raiding less profitable and more dangerous. The strengthening of European kingdoms and the improvement of coastal defenses reduced opportunities for successful raids, while the Christianization of Scandinavia created new ideological frameworks that gradually discouraged the most extreme forms of bride capture, though the practice continued in modified forms well into the High Medieval period. The legacy of Viking bride capture practices extends far beyond their immediate historical period, influencing European attitudes toward marriage, women's rights, and cultural identity for centuries to come. The systematic nature of these abductions and the legal frameworks that supported them reveal how organized violence against women could become normalized within societies that otherwise valued honor and courage, demonstrating the ways in which patriarchal power structures could justify almost any level of abuse against women who were defined as outsiders or enemies. As we confront this darkest aspect of Viking expansion, we must acknowledge that the same maritime skills and military organization that enabled remarkable achievements in exploration and trade also facilitated systematic campaigns of terror against civilian populations, with women bearing a disproportionate burden of suffering that continued long after the initial violence of raids had ended. The captured brides of the Viking Age represent not footnotes to medieval history, but central figures in understanding how conquest and colonization function at the most intimate and devastating personal level. The story of these women reminds us that behind every tale of Viking adventure and exploration lies a corresponding narrative of loss, trauma, and cultural destruction that was deliberately hidden from the heroic sagas that celebrated Norse achievements. Their suffering challenges us to recognize that historical progress and cultural expansion have often been built upon the systematic exploitation of the most vulnerable, and that understanding the full truth of the past requires us to listen for voices that were systematically silenced and to honor memories that were deliberately erased from the official record of history.